I am very pleased to be talking with Vinod Khosla this morning. I think last we spoke in any sort of qualitative way was probably about 6 years ago at the Always On Summit.
She has a better memory than I do. Good morning, everybody.
So, Vinod, you are a Valley legend, if I may say, certainly from the time you started working in the Valley, helping found and acting as CEO of Sun Microsystems, then going to Kleiner Perkins. There's a 2-year break, though, in between, I think, at least in all the information that I have, between, I think, 94 and 96. What were you doing? Or is it 84 and 86, I guess it was. What were you doing?
Yeah. Well, first, good morning, everybody. It's great to be here. We're going to ignore anything we have planned. If you have questions, tweet them to Kathy, and we'd love to keep responding. She'll
Please.
keep an eye on it. I want to start by sort of telling you that I'm really glad to be here, and this is no joke. This conference is probably the only time in the last decade I've ever asked anybody to speak at a conference.
So you like to talk about failure?
I love to talk about failure. I get swamped with speaking requests. I probably get over 100 a month. And it's the only time I can remember, I was trying to remember in the last 10 years that I've ever called somebody and said, I'd like to speak at a conference, and this is it.
So that's excellent. So why is it that you feel that it's so important to talk about failure?
You know, and that's probably a great place to start. Why is it so important? I've always felt that my willingness to succeed gives me the ability to, my willingness to fail gives me an ability to succeed. When I started the biofuels effort, and we can go back to the early days, Harvard Business School did a case on the Khosla Ventures biofuel strategy. Right at the top of the case, before they started the introduction, they put this quote from me: my willingness to fail gives me the ability to succeed. I fundamentally decided a long time ago I wouldn't care about any failure. I wouldn't care about what others thought. I wouldn't care. I would only care about what I thought was worth trying and just do it. I also think, and this is a very important part of failure for me, that I don't mind failing, but if we succeed, it better be worth succeeding, which is the flip side of failure, which sort of explains my attitude.
What do you mean by worth succeeding, then?
I was just getting to it. You know, I find most people, especially in the venture community, in the financial community, try and reduce risk, which is a good thing generally, but most people reduce risk to the point where what you're doing is so riskless that when you succeed, it's inconsequential. So in the process of reducing risk, they reduce the consequences of success to inconsequential. And this is why it becomes important to take the risks and not be afraid of failure, and to truly talk about what happens when you take those risks. I fundamentally believe big companies don't innovate, and they don't innovate because nobody wants to be a failure in a big company. It hurts their careers. And in many ways, if you're early in your life and career, or don't have Steve Jobs-like status, it's actually great because you have the freedom to fail, and most people don't notice. And if you're not afraid to fail yourself, it's very liberating. When I finished business school at Stanford, I jumped into a startup because I love two things about that. First, I told my VCs, if we win, we win. if we lose, you lose. The VCs lose, not me. This was a great deal. And frankly, I told them I had nothing to lose but my student loans. I had nothing else. So it's important to ask the question, what is the consequence of failure?
Like, what's the worst thing that could possibly
What's
happen?
the worst thing that could happen? Usually it's pretty much more trivial. It's mostly in our head. And what's in our head prevents us from trying the things that let us really have successes that are consequential.
You mentioned big companies and challenges with innovation. You also mentioned Steve Jobs. I definitely want to speak with him about him a little bit as well. But there's a question here from Catherine Webster. Your thoughts on what happened to Sun Microsystems?
Sun's a complex story. In the last 10 years, I wasn't that close to it. But fundamentally, I think Sun didn't take enough risks. They didn't try enough new things. Let me give you a little bit of history on how to manage risk and failure. Nobody likes to fail, but it's important not to be afraid to fail. But it's also important to keep questioning yourself. Failing with overconfidence is a bad idea. One of my favorite books is a book Andy Grove, the founder of Intel, wrote called Only the Paranoid Survive. When you're doing something new, you are going to fail, you are taking a risk. No risk, no rewards. But if you are taking a risk, it's important to constantly get the best feedback you can. To constantly question yourself and see what you're doing wrong. And to make each failure as small as possible by rapidly adjusting and pivoting, whatever the Valley term is, on your strategy. I find either people don't want to take risk or they're so overconfident, and I can talk about 3DO, which was a pretty fun failure for me, where you get overconfident and arrogant and don't need to listen to anybody because you're hot shit, right?
What about the people who have that attitude before they've actually succeeded?
Well, and I think that's a big problem with entrepreneurs. Most entrepreneurs fail not because of what they know, not because of what they're really good at, because they ignored what they don't know and didn't know what they didn't know.
And didn't think to ask or
And didn't think to ask. I tell entrepreneurs, and don't do this to me, but even if you're not looking for VC funding, go ask VCs about your plan. At the very least, they'll critique it for you. Find out failure modes that they're worried about that might happen. Collecting every possible way your ideas might fail, and building contingency plans is really important. I don't want this to be a monologue, but as part of contingency
I'll interrupt you, don't worry.
Yeah, part of contingency plans, this is just a stream of consciousness, not what we had planned, but that's okay. You want to keep adjusting and keep questioning and keep testing and modifying, but it's also important that you be obstinate about your vision. And this is a delicate balance of how you get input on what is working and what isn't. You briefly mentioned Steve Jobs. My favorite thing about Steve Jobs is when everybody in the press was saying a phone without a keyboard would never work, and RIM was adding more, and Blackberries were adding more keys to your keyboard. They were adding going from 8 or 9 keys to a whole keyboard. Steve went the other way because he passionately believed in what he was doing. He had a vision, and he didn't lose his vision. I'm sure he tried the phone in many different ways and kept adjusting and modifying that vision. But he didn't lose the essence of it, which was to create a new experience for people. And so that's a delicate balance. There's no magic formula. Get as much input as possible, get as much critique as possible, ignore the people who look at your stuff and are hypocritically polite, and most input you get directly will be hypocritically polite. And you have to find ways to not pay attention to it because it can give you overconfidence. And most people don't like being blunt. And look for the people who will critique you, look for ways in which you might fail, and start adjusting for it quickly. If each failure is a small failure, you've achieved the goal of doing the optimal thing.
So you were. Let's talk a little bit more about your own experience of failure. So you made a conscious decision when you were a teenager that technology was the direction that you wanted to go. You read something about Intel, you were looking at what this was all about, it must have intrigued you. I think you were reading the EE Times or something, so not exactly what most teenagers might necessarily be reading, but clearly you were wired for this at an early age. And technology is fraught with failure. Technology and the sciences are fraught with failure. Can you remember when you hit your first real wall, when you made your first really big, oh, maybe I should have gone that way, and what you learned from that?
Boy, for me, no one thing catches my mind. Probably the first time I really faced sort of this issue of overconfidence and suddenly running smack into a wall was when we did a company called Dynabook. And then after that, we did a company called Go. Somebody has their hand raised.
Oh.
Yeah. Go ahead.
Do you want to finish about Dynabook?
Okay. Dynabook and Go were both examples of, because I was on the board and John Dewar was on the board of both companies, and we hired sort of management with great titles. We thought we had it made, and we sort of didn't examine our assumptions enough. Each was a very different case, and so I'm going to take a diversion here for a minute, but let me tell you what we learned. In Dynabook, we had hired the guy who ran the PC business for IBM, and I was young enough to realize that not to realize that the big title didn't mean much. Because somebody had a big title didn't mean they were good at something. It was true they'd gone through the experience, but what they did with the experience wasn't very clear to me. And since then, I've stopped believing all authority. It's valuable to get people who have the experience, but between somebody smart and somebody experienced, I'll pick smart or every time. And there we realized how big a role people play in what you do. I still think Dynabook was a great idea. By the time we had created a lot of money and a lot of egg on our face, I actually wanted to restart it and do it right. Go was interesting because it was a completely different lesson for us. Go, we were making a tablet computer, think iPad back in the 80s. But we used a pen, and marketing guys came up with a catchy slogan, "The pen's the point." And we started believing that bullshit, but in fact the pen wasn't the point. After we failed, we said, so what really matters? And what really mattered was real mobility was the point, not the pen. And we got caught up in the technology and the pen. I won't go too deep into it, but say one thing. The best thing you can do with failure is really examine it. Just this weekend, I was reading a post on that Bryce.vc. It's just a small venture firm here. I was reading Bryce is a guy who writes this blog, and he wrote a blog on the value of postmortems. After you fail, you learn a lot more. Even if you created 5, 10, 15, and we've created as much as 50 million in a bad startup, going back and examining at every step what you could have learned, what you could have done different, is well worth it. It's the single most important thing you can do with your failure, is ask lots of people when you should have done what different. And learn. If the only thing you learn is to get lots of input or lots of flexibility, it's a good thing. Most people who fail are better at doing startups than people who've never failed. And so that's good news if some of you have failed. How many of you feel you failed at something? Can we have a show of hands? Great. That's why I'm here.
And if they didn't put their hand up, they're too busy typing or they're lying. No. We had a question about midway back. Was there a question, Cassie? Oh.
Is that on?
Can you stand up so we can see you?
My question is...
What's your name?
My name is Eitan Urbis, and I'm with Mailshop. My question is, can you give any advice as to how to recognize when you're failing because of bad strategy versus bad execution?
That's a great question. Not that I have a clear answer, just because it's so specific. But I will tell you, the standard expert opinion is that's been tried before. Almost any time something new comes up, I ask people, and somebody will tell me, oh, that was tried before. I'd say if you fundamentally believe something is a good idea, if you believe something is a value proposition people need, you could be wrong on strategy in assuming how many people need that. But usually, ideas fail because of tactics, not because of strategy. Right? You fail because you implemented it wrong. You know, Friendster was a Kleiner-funded startup. I was a Kleiner then. The idea was exactly right. And they failed when you could just say, hey, social networking doesn't work, till Mark comes along and proves Facebook proves you wrong. In fact, I'd say more often than not, when I say when something's not working, change, what I meant was don't change the vision, change the tactics. Adjust, try different things, try different experiences. Sometimes you're just wrong in guessing at a market.
What if you're too early? I mean, there are lots of ideas that have just been a little early.
Yeah, and then you just keep trying and bring it back up. I mean, don't give up when it starts to succeed. You want to be there. One of the things I want to say about failure is, when you do a startup, you may be on the right track, on the right strategy, the right basic concept, or if you're a gamer, sort of the high concept for the game. But there's probably 3 or 4 things you can control out of 10 that matter in the success of failure. 3 or 4 things your competitors may control, and 3 or 4 things may be just environmental factors that make you lucky or unlucky. Something happened, some blog wrote about it, it caught fire, and suddenly things took off. Right? And so you have to realize that. And one of the things with failure is keep making lots of adjustments, don't give up on the vision. Because one of the things I say about persistence is give yourself enough time to get lucky. If this is true, and I truly believe for every great startup, if there's 10 factors that matter most why it was successful, you control 3 or 4, your competitors control 3 or 4, and the rest are just plain luck. Right? Any one of the things that happened to Facebook could have happened slightly differently. We've seen plenty of lawsuits, debates, arguments. Any one of those things could have gone a little bit left or right. and the world would have been a different place. And in fact, if I come back to my favorite example of Steve Jobs and sort of Apple as a great success story, if you think about the history of Steve, Steve had a great vision in the original Mac, right? That was done very well. Steve had that capability. But then there were some things he didn't do right, and they got in other management. Huh? The best thing that happened to Steve is the other management, or succession of CEOs they had after that, really screwed up Apple. If they hadn't screwed up Apple, if they'd done okay, Steve wouldn't have had a chance to come back. Steve's legacy would be, oh, he started Next and it failed. Right? So think about how lucky he got that the people before him, the CEO before him, screwed up.
So your success can be based on someone else's failure.
It was an environmental factor that gave him the platform. And in a funny way, if Apple had a lot to lose when he came back, first, if it was successful enough where they'd said, hey, this is a valuable company, we can't try really large experiments, he wouldn't have been given the opportunity to really change the strategy. Because Apple was failing and didn't have a lot to lose, they took this sort of home run swing. You know, if you're 3 runs down in the bottom of the ninth, you might as well take a home run swing. And Steve had an opportunity, mostly because of circumstances, to express his vision and follow it. That turned into the most valuable company in the world. The fact is, Steve's strengths were always there, including the time he was not at Apple, including the time he attempted something different at Next and mostly failed at it.
You talk a little bit about the difference between good failure and bad failure. It's not, all failure is not the same. How do you differentiate between the two?
So, if you're obstinate about your failures or don't recognize them, it's not a good failure. Being obstinate about your vision, I'm pretty patient with. But you always want to question your assumptions. If you don't do a post-mortem on every failure, that's a bad failure. If you learn a lot from your failure and reapply it, and don't give up on what your larger vision is, that's a good failure. And lots of small failures means lots of learning. And so good or bad failure is more about attitude than anything else.
What about
how are we doing on those questions?
You're doing well. We're kind of, I've been sprinkling them through. So there's a great question here from Alexander. What would you recommend to a student chasing passions after graduation or several years in a structured environment? Working for the man or working for yourself?
So I'll give you my bias. How many people here over the age of 30?
I'm not raising my hand.
Okay. I find that people fundamentally stop trying new things after the age of 30. And it's great that all of you are here, right? I'm over 30, so I can say that. After 45, people basically die. They stop thinking.
Start measuring myself for a pine box now.
Yeah. They stop following.
I don't need it for a number of years, of course.
They keep doing what they were doing before, right? And it's the worst thing that can happen. The fundamental notion is if you don't try something new, you're not going to do anything new. Right? It's sort of self-evident. And people want to do something new, but they don't want to take any risk. Right? And to try new things, first, to me, it's like being alive. It's about trying new things, trying new experiences, getting outside your comfort zone. I brought along a bunch of quotes. Maybe we'll have time to sprinkle them, but let me pull one out. This one is, courage is doing what you're afraid to do. There can be no courage unless you're scared. Right?
I have a favorite quote that I'd like to share.
So,
Do or not do. Do not, there is no try. It's Yoda. We actually have a question in front here. I was actually watching as eyebrows were moving independently over here, and a kind of gasp when you said that people die after 45.
I'm here to refute that, Vinod. I'm 59 and I failed at getting venture last year in London after 5 years, and instead of like crying into my suit, what I did was I had promised years ago to help women raise venture, so I started a project video interviewing VCs and angels and women founders on the shortfall of funding for women. And I'm wondering if you would give us some advice for women who are sourcing venture. I know we're in a similar situation to the Indians in Silicon Valley many years ago, and I wondered if you've got any pertinent advice from that model that would support women in raising venture now.
okay, let me come back to, so let me answer that question, but let's be sure to come back to the original question, which I didn't answer. Okay. I wandered off as usual about what to do after graduation.
Don't die.
You know, I grew up, I don't mean to avoid questions, I just forget and I wander off. But I personally, I'm 56, so I say that because I'm encouraging people to stop doing what they used to be doing and stop becoming creatures of habit and try new things. Because it's a lot more fun. If you allow yourself failure, it's a lot more real living and being alive to try new things. I personally don't believe, and I grew up in Silicon Valley, so maybe this is a bias statement, that there's any difference between young and old, women, men, in trying new things, or how much venture capitalists accept or reject that idea of, oh, I'll only, I won't fund women. I don't buy that. But I can easily see how it might be true in other locations, in other cultures. I just don't have any experience with it. But San Francisco is an unusually open and accepting place, so maybe I have a biased view of the world. I never really saw any bias against me being Indian when I was starting out, even though there weren't very many Indians in Silicon Valley, and so I sort of cringe a little bit when people use that as an excuse. Maybe they're using it as an excuse and we should really follow assumptions. Having said that, what I do think is really important is to set up role models. The single most high leverage way to do things is to set up role models. And I'd sort of take a few women examples and say, hey, they've been very, very successful. Marissa Mayer at Google's great example. So role models in every area, no matter what part of the world you are at, is the single biggest way to encourage an entrepreneurial environment. All the government programs usually don't mean anything. You know, people sitting in secure bureaucratic jobs trying to encourage you to innovate or design entrepreneurial programs when they've never been through one. They don't know what success is, what failure is. My favorite thing about startups is a quote I started using in the 80s called, "Those who dare to dream the dreams and are foolish enough to try and make them come true." Because the foolish part is the key operative word. You know, if it was reasonable, other people would be doing it. And so unless you're either foolish or unreasonable, you're not going to try stuff. And when you try stuff, you'll fail. In fact, George Bernard Shaw said, all progress depends on the unreasonable man. So let me...
Back to the student question.
Yeah, let me go back to the original question of graduation. look, it's always great to get a few years of experience in somebody else's context. You can do learning at their expense. But if you have an idea you're really, really passionate about, I'd say jump in. Don't do a startup because you want to do a startup. Do a startup right out of college if you're really passionate about something.
Isn't that a reason, I mean, in general, for entrepreneurs, you should always be seizing something that's a passion rather than just to be?
Yeah, absolutely. People who say, I want to do a startup and find a startup may not find the best startup. People who have a passion about something and say, I'm going to jump in to make this happen because it's my vision, that's great. My daughter is 23, just started something because she said, hey, I love Facebook, I use Facebook, but Facebook is dumbing teenage girls down because there's no serious discussion on any topic. And so she wants to do a startup on serious discussion. Now she's passionate about it, she'd do much better learning about startups, joining another startup. But I said, go for it. So she's doing her own startup, she has 3 people, and great.
I guess it's genetic. We have a great question here from Inga about your thoughts on clean tech as a slow young industry with many failures like Solyndra.
Solyndra is not a slow young failure, it's a big visible failure. Two types of failures, right? There are plenty of failures where you start and the idea is fundamentally wrong. You're trying a new idea, a new market, you're creating a new market, and it doesn't work. There's plenty of those. Solyndra is a different class of failure, and we should distinguish it. Whenever something's obvious, the idea of solar cells isn't new. It wasn't a new market. It was a new product for an existing market. And there were 10 companies shooting to go after the product. And so whether you're talking about solar cells or wind turbines or LED lights or new kinds of engines, those markets are fairly well established. And the question you have to say, when you're producing a solar cell, did you produce the cheapest, best, in some other way, solar cell? Solyndra didn't, and it failed. When 10 people shoot at a single goal, only one person wins. Somebody places, you either win, place, or show and stay in business. But most companies doing solar cells will in fact fail. And that's a different kind of failure. You ran the race and somebody has to come last. In fact, there's only 3 people who can make the podium by winning, placing, or showing. And that's just the nature of startups. So every area, it'll happen in LEDs too. There'll be 10 startups, there are more than 10, and most will fail. Because in the end, one will have the best LED.
We have a question back on the side here.
Hi, my name is Christina and I'm with Honeybee, and I have a question about failure as it relates to a misalignment between the management team of a young organization and the investors that you bring on. Something that I've witnessed before is the management team goes after funding and they get some great options, and they end up spending a lot of their time moving forward trying to sort of meet the request of their investors. And I was wondering if you have any advice about how to vet potential investors to make sure that you truly have alignment on your vision and focus for the product and the organization.
Yeah, that's a hard one. Look, most questions related to failure are hard ones. They're not obvious ones. Failure isn't a party. Failure is something you deal with and get the most out of. Most entrepreneurs don't realize they're not looking for money as the principal time. They don't realize what they're looking for is a partner who can help and guide. When I get asked, hey, what makes you a great venture capitalist? My usual answer is, first, I've worked with more startups than most VCs, and I've failed more often than most VCs, so I know what questions to ask. And hopefully, I have a library of failures that's longer than most people's, so I can help you avoid some of them. But to your specific question, what you want to look in a VC is flexibility. If they have a very clear view of what you're doing, they're probably the wrong VC. They're probably not a very good VC to begin with, right? You want somebody who takes an experimental approach, doesn't mind you missing plan. I'm always defending, even within our partnership, ventures that miss their plans. I don't really care about plans because plans are meaningless. I don't even believe in making plans, business plans, because I've never seen one actually be accurate. You know, but vetting VCs for flexibility is probably the only thing I can suggest. The best thing you can do.
Also needs to be a personality match of some sort, though.
Well, yeah, personality is always important because you want to get along, but that usually translates into flexibility. The one piece of advice I can give you is talk to people who've been with that VC where the plan didn't go according to plan. Right? That's probably the single most important piece of advice I can give you. They'll trot out, you know, if you ask me, hey, who did I invest in? I'll say, hey, Jack Dorsey at Twitter. But you really want the ones that failed or had to redo things or missed their plans and say, how did you handle that? So that's important advice.
So you'll invest in someone who's failed so long as they failed in an intelligent sort of way.
Yeah, absolutely. So that's good news for some of you.
So you can fail, just don't be stupid. That's all right. We have a question here also from Alexander. Can a non-PhD hardcore scientist add value to a clean energy startup as a founding member?
Yes. You know, it depends on the stage of a company. If what a company is trying to do, hardcore R&D in building the best solar junction cell and trying to get efficiency up or cost down, you probably can't. But a good, intelligent, critical thinking person without sort of that PhD can absolutely add a thing. When we were talking about failure earlier, we were talking about realizing when you're failing, when you want to stick with your vision, when you want to change. The answers to those questions come from asking critical questions. The ability to question and ask the right questions to sort of say, hey, why are we really doing this? What are our competitors doing really well? What are our competitors? Every entrepreneur knows how their competitors are screwing up. They don't pay attention to what their competitors are doing well. They don't pay attention to where they're screwing up. The net result is an addition of your assets with your liabilities. And you not only build strategies for your assets, but you build strategies that minimize the impact of your liabilities in your plan. You do the same thing for your competitors. So a non-sort of PhD person in an environment who's awesome at framing questions and asking hard questions can make a very large contribution. And I encourage every one of you to learn how to do that critically.
I think there was a question right here. Did you have a question? Yeah. And Patricia, we can come to you afterwards.
I'm Sven from Market 2 Estonia, and you said that post-mortal analysis is very important, and you said also that you failed a lot yourself. So, what do you learn from your failures?
Well, one of the things I learned is once you fail often enough, you learn to ignore them. At least my meta learning is trying new things first keeps me interested and alive. I don't need to sort of do drugs to stay interested and keep my mind busy, because I have enough interesting problems to work on. You know, and no, seriously, I think people get bored, and they get trapped in other things that aren't that interesting. You know, you might get interested in making sure you have the latest clothes or something, but you know, that's because you don't have a good outlet for your mind where you say finding a good dress is irrelevant. There are more important things to work on. But let me tell you something about failure that actually ties into this idea of small, rapid iterations and not necessarily trying to build business plans. I jokingly said most business plans are irrelevant, most experts are full of shit. You have to stop believing the nonsense people tell you of what can't be done. What I've learned is trying new things, trying different things, and trying big risks is not about business plans, it's about option value. So for those of you who are financially inclined, I get asked this question, how do you make investments if you don't know what to do and you don't mind failing? It's about creating options. It's the consequences of failure. If you succeed, if you don't fail, what happens? And you want to create the largest outcome when you succeed. It is what most VCs eliminate. Trying new things is about creating option value. So if you look at it, if you say, if I succeed, what will happen? That's the vision you should shoot for. If you're a financial number cruncher, option value is what you go for. This is why I've said publicly that if something has a 90% probability of failure as a new technology, especially in clean tech, I'm happy to still try it. I've said this publicly many, many times. Now, some reporters take everything I say and say everything I invest in has a 90% chance of failure. That's not what I meant, but I don't really care what reporters write. I do think taking large risks is just fine if the consequences of failure are huge and impactful. I'll give you, well, maybe we should try and answer.
We've got one more question here. I think we've had time probably for one more.
Hi, my name is Pamela Day, and with your hindsight, looking back at failures, how many of them were about you not listening to your intuition?
I would say that wasn't very often the case for me, but when things started failing, very often I found myself making the mistake of justifying why I was on the right path. I didn't get brutally honest with myself early enough. Because you had a belief system, you took all the data that supported your belief system and rejected all the data that didn't support your belief system. Let me finish with two quick things. First, as you try entrepreneurial things, there's lots of experts who will tell you what is or isn't true, what is or isn't possible in certain markets. My strong advice, ignore the experts. And I'll give you statistically valid data. Professor Tetlock at UC Berkeley studied 80,000 such expert forecasts from 250 of the best experts over 20 years. Average statistical accuracy of experts in their opinions about markets and economics and politics, about the same as dart-throwing monkeys. This is statistically valid data. The last thing I'll leave you with is there are plenty of people who you think are successful that failed often before they succeeded. I've talked a little bit about Steve Jobs. Max Levchin started PayPal. He had four startup failures before he started PayPal. Jack Dorsey, he's done Twitter and now Square, where I'm on the board of Square. He's failed plenty of times. In fact, his early startups didn't fail. Twitter was a spin-off of a startup they had done. And even after it started, in some ways, the board picked somebody else other than Jack, and he was basically out of the company. So now they want him back, much like Steve Jobs. Now he started Square, which is also successful. So just because you failed, don't give up, but keep examining your assumptions. Thank you all very much.
Thank you.